This is my curriculum design by Stephanie Herndon Morris. For this curriculum, it is designed for second graders in Georgia, so it follows the Georgia standards. And it goes through 3 units through phonics, reading, and writing. And it's to enhance students' abilities to be confident in their learning. So, this curriculum design is for second grade literacy to focus on building foundational reading and writing skills that support young learners' academic growth. This is centered around Georgia standards of excellence. This curriculum emphasizes 3 key areas: reading comprehension through identifying key ideas and details, prefixes and suffixes, and narrative writing. These components work together to strengthen students' ability to decode words, understand text, and express their ideas clearly in writing. By integrating these literacy skills, the curriculum supports students in becoming confident, independent readers and writers, prepared for continued academic success. So this follows them through 3rd grade, all the way up through 12th grade and beyond. And the narrative writing is a key component going forth into 3rd grade, where students will have to be able to produce narrative writing during the Georgia milestones. So this curriculum includes phonics, comprehension of reading and writing. So for phonics, we're focusing on prefixes and suffixes. Our reading, we're focusing on key ideas and details, and then our writing, we're focusing mainly on narrative writing. So our phonics standards are to know and apply grade level phonics and word analysis skills in decoding words. And we're focusing on our subtopic of decode words with common prefixes and suffixes. In reading, we're focused on reading literature versus reading informational. So during these units of study, students will ask and answer such questions as who, what, where, when, why, and how to demonstrate understanding of key details in the text. They will recount stories, including fables and folk tales from diverse cultures, and determine their central message, lesson, or moral. They will describe how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges, describe the overall structure of a story, including describing how the beginning introduces the story, the middle provides major events and challenges, and the ending includes the action. They will acknowledge differences and points of view of characters, including by speaking in a different voice for each character when reading dialogue aloud. Use information gained from illustrations and words in a print or digital text to demonstrate understanding of its character, setting, or plot, and compare and contrast 2 or more versions of the same story. So the state gave the example of Cinderella stories by different authors or from different cultures. And then our writing standards, students will write narratives in which they recount a well-elaborated event or short sequence of events. Include details to describe actions, thoughts, and feelings. Use temporal words to signal event order and provide a sense of closure. With guidance and support from adults and peers, focus on a topic and strengthen writing as needed by revising and editing. With guidance and support from adults, use a variety of tools to produce and publish writing, including digital tools and collaboration with peers. Demonstrate command of conventions of standard English, capitalization, punctuation, and spelling when writing. So through those standards, we're going to focus on the scope and sequence for each of those topics. So for phonics, we're going to do week 1, introduction to prefixes. Week 2 and 3 are going to focus on understanding. Week 2 is on and re. And week 3 is pre and miss. Week 4 is a review and a prefix game where we put everything that we've learned together and show what we know. Then week 5, we're going to introduce suffixes, and week 6, 7, we're going to work on understanding full, less, and then 7, understanding ER and EST. Then week 8, we're going to have a suffix story time where we focus on applying those suffixes into our work, and then week 9 is going to be an assessment and showcase week. For reading, we're going to break it apart from those standards. So week 1, we'll focus on characters. Week 2, setting and plot. Week 3, problem and solution. Week 4, story structure. Week 5, author's purpose and point of view. Week 6 is a text to self connections. Week 7, comparing story versions. Week 8, illustrations and text meaning. And week 9 is going to be our literacy showcase, where we show everything that we've learned through this unit. And then for writing, we're going to focus on introducing a narrative writing through week 1. Week 2, we're going to work on our ideas. Week 3, we're going to actually plan out what happens in our story. Week 4, we're going to write the beginning. Week 5, we're going to write the middle and the problem and events. Week 6 is going to be focusing on the ending, so the solution and conclusion of our story. Week 7 is going to focus on revising our story. Week 8 is going to focus on editing and publishing. And during week 7 and week 8, we're going to talk about how revising and editing are two very different things. And then week 9, we're going to focus on sharing and reflection of our narrative writing unit. So now we're going to look at each week in detail through focusing on a phonics, a reading, and a writing for each week. And then we're going to go week by week throughout the units. So phonics was our first unit that we're going to focus on through our day. And this is week 1, where we're introducing the prefixes. So we're focusing on un, re, and pre this week, which are typically some of the easier prefixes. So our objective is to identify and understand the purpose of prefixes. So why do we use prefixes? Some of the activities we're going to do is a prefix detective, where students go and find prefixes in authentic text, so libraries, decodables, through Epic when they're on their Chromebooks during small group time. Anywhere that they can get their hands or mind into a book, we're looking for those prefixes. And then build words using prefixes and base words, puzzle pieces. So this is going to be the manipulative of a prefix goes before, the base word goes after the prefixes, and putting them together to understand what that new word means. For technology, we're going to have vocabulary prefixes video, and then students will be able to work through Nearpod in an interactive lesson where they sort and group prefixes. Some strategies would be direct instruction, mapping of the words, and then anchor charts showing prefix meanings similar to the one that is on the board. Then differentiation will be visual supports. So students would have a prefix, the base word in like picture form, and then put it together in the example. Small group modeling for those students that still need that extra support. And then progress monitoring will be quick exit tickets to define and use a word with the prefix, just to kind of check their understanding. And then our cultural connection will be to use real world words such as redo, homework, unlock, just to show that a prefix does come back to everyday life. So the next unit we're going to focus on is reading for week 1, and students will meet the characters and understand the characters. So students will identify the main characters in stories. Students will also describe character traits using text evidence. This focuses on RL 2.1 and RL 2.3. So the activities for this would be to read Mean Gene the Recess Queen, create a character trait anchor chart similar to the one you see right here, and then draw and label their favorite character with traits. So this could be from Mean Gene the Recess Queen, or it could be from a story that they read in the last unit, or their favorite library book where they're focusing on their favorite character. So technology that we would use would be the PBS Kids character game, where students can go in and make it through the computer to make their own character. And then strategies would be think, pair, share, and character webs, where we're creating and understanding what each character in our story is representing. Some differentiation would be sentence stems and visual supports, where students are creating when students are creating their own character. So sentence stems of this character had blank hair, and they could go in and create that. And then visual supports would include the anchor charts, and the Mean Gene would be a great example for students to use for their character. Progress monitoring would be an exit ticket to describe 2 character traits of Mean Gene, and to include the text evidence that they see through that. Some cultural awareness that I feel students would need would be to read Ruby's Wish, which is a Chinese American family, and they are very similar to things that students need to be able to understand. So the main character, and the different character traits that Ruby has. And then we're going into writing for week 1. That's our introduction. So introducing our narrative. What is a narrative? So students will identify the elements of a narrative, so character, setting, beginning, middle, end. Students will read and listen to The Relatives Came by Patricia Polacco. And then students will create an anchor chart of what is a narrative, so similar to what you see on the screen right here, where it includes the characters, the problem, the solution, the beginning, the middle, the end, the setting, all the things that a narrative has to have. And then students will play a story element sorting game, where they will determine if this is a character, a setting, a beginning, a middle, or an end of The Relatives Came. And then we will also use technology, since we have to revisit this story throughout the week. We will use Epic to read it to us after the first day, to save a little bit of time so we can get into our activities. So the strategies that I would use would be think, pair, share, and graphic organizers that students can create and refer back to. Differentiation would be the audiobook, so students can listen at their own pace. The visuals of the anchor chart, and then small group discussions in our small group time throughout the week about who are our characters, what is the setting, what's the beginning, the middle, or the end, and being able to apply it not only to The Relatives Came, but to other texts that we're working on. And then progress monitoring for this unit would be before we taught the whole unit, writing sample. So students would have to take a day to do that. And that would be a pre-assessment for the unit, so that whenever we finish the unit, we can look back and see the students' growth from beginning to end after all the explicit instructions given. And then we're going into week 2 of our phonics. So this is understanding un and re in our prefixes. So that would be decode and explain un and re words in context. The activities would include to create a bifoldable with un and re words, similar to what you see over here. Just focusing on un and re though. And the students would act out words with the prefixes, so they would act out having to redo something, unlock something, and then we would just keep creating un and re prefixes so that every student had a chance to act it out. Students would use technology by having a boom card sorting activity, where they have to understand what the prefix and the base word come together to mean in order to sort it into the meaning of, is it asking you to do something again, or asking you to not do something, or the opposite, like unlock. Strategies that we would focus on using would be word study, real life examples, and a guided release, where it's I do, we do, and then you do for students. to practice that scaffolding so they are better able to understand what each of these prefixes mean. Differentiation would be sentence frames and visuals, but also small group explicit instructions for students that aren't getting that in the guided release format where they're able to focus on working themselves. And then our progress monitoring for this would be to match the prefix, the base, and the meaning worksheet to understand if we're understanding the prefixes on and re, and then putting them with the base word to understand what the meaning of each word is. And then community connection would be to interview someone who had to redo something in their life. So that could be their mom, their dad, their sister, their brother, just getting kids talking to each other, talking to other people that are in their lives versus just sitting and not having that communication aspect in their home. And then for reading for week 2, we're going to explore the setting and the plot. So the objective is students will identify setting and key story events, and then students will also be able to describe how the setting influences the story. So this focuses on RL 2.1. So our activities would be to read Abuela and discuss the New York setting. Something that many kids in my classroom haven't seen is that New York setting, because most of our stories take place around things that I know they see in their real life, so they can apply it to themselves. Students will complete the story map, and then they will create and draw their favorite setting. So technology, we would take a whole day just to explore real story locations through Google Earth of New York, because many of the students in my class and in our school have not seen outside of our city or even county limits, or even our state. So that taking that day to let them see what real New York looks like and the difference between our small town and the big town, and talking about the differences that you would see there. Some strategies that I would use would be graphic organizers for sequencing and setting, similar to the one that's on the over here on this side, where students are able to visually see and apply what we're talking about. Then differentiation would be templates, scaffolded timeline, where we go through and I say during this we did this, and then having students and we would build that scaffolded that timeline together. And then a problem and solution map where we would focus on this is one problem, this was one solution, because many stories that we have read will have more than one problem, but there will just be one main problem that we're talking about. But having all these other little problems that come up from page to page and having students be able to digest them before we start talking about this whole story and all the different problems and solutions that were available. And then progress monitoring will be just observations through the instruction for the week. And then cultural awareness. I said since our county has many travel agencies and agents, we could get one of them to come in, since I know many of them have traveled to many different places. We could get them to come in and talk about the various cities they've seen around the world, their favorite city, or even have one of our local tour guides come and talk about our city, just to let them know, like, these are things that are in your city, your town, that you should be interested in and looking into. And then writing for this week would focus on generating ideas. So the objective is students will brainstorm ideas based on personal experiences. And so we will have a heart map to show our important memories. And then we will create one of these as a class as well to start working on our class story that we will complete to model each step of the writing process for the students. And then a character swap where we'll put characters in different stories. So Cinderella in the setting of the Three Little Pigs, and Abuela in the setting of Mean Gene and see how their different characters would respond to those settings. The technology I said we would use would be Flip. So students will use this technology to record a short story that they want to write about for their narrative. And this allows students to talk to their computer rather than having to write everything. Since we're starting to move into a much more technology-driven class, this will allow students to practice that technology in the classroom. Strategies would be modeling and guided writing, which is going through and going step by step and showing students what is expected and what it should look like. And students will be encouraged to write about their home heritage or life through the story. So we want them to focus on things that have happened to them rather than things that have happened to someone else. And this just allows them to tell part of their story. Differentiation will be sentence frames, visuals, and graphic organizers to help those students that are still struggling. And then progress monitoring would be to create well-developed characters. So they would go into something similar to that PBS Kids character game, and they would write out what their character is thinking, what their character is feeling, what they are doing to create that well-developed character. The next week is week 3, and that is for phonics. We're understanding pre and miss. The objective is students will decode and explain pre and miss words in reading and writing. So the activities would be to make prefix posters for pre and miss. So the students would have to make one for pre, and then the students would then have to turn around and make one for miss. And that would be include the prefix, the meaning, examples, and using it in a sentence, just to keep for them to focus back and reflect on so they can remember what each prefix meant. And it allows for students to have a more in control idea of what they're making. Then prefix Pictionary, students will draw out the prefixes, so what it means to do something like preheat, do it before you actually building up the heat. Miss is wrong or bad, so misbehaving would be a good word for prefix Pictionary. And then students will create a prefix sort where they have to sort out the meaning and the prefix and the examples. And then technology, students will practice prefixes with Lexia, and then students will have access to various learning activities in Lexia where they will practice those prefixes. And then strategies that we would use would be word part focus and context clues, graphic organizers, explicit instruction, and modeling of these things. And this allows for students to get that explicit instruction where they are needed to create these activities. And differentiation will be common roots with examples, and then building words with manipulatives like we did in week 1, where they built the prefix and the root word and saw that the prefix had to come before the root word and put it together. And then progress monitoring will be an affix sort quiz where they had to sort the words, sort the prefix, sort the meaning, and the examples. And then also reading fluency, being able to apply what they know and read a short passage fluently, and then be able to turn around and tell me what it means. And then week 3, reading would be all about facing challenges. So students will describe how characters respond to challenges, and this focuses on RL 2.3. And our objectives would be to read Anansi and the Moss-Covered Rock, which is a African folktale. And students will finish a problem and solution chart similar to one over here where we talk about the big problem, all the different solutions, and then what finally solves that problem. And then students will act out story events from Anansi and the Moss Covered Rock, where they're able to take their knowledge of what happened and put it through their body to show a deeper understanding. And then our technology through YouTube, we could watch the animated Anansi stories, where people have animated the story and show what is actually happening through video. And then strategies that would be used would be read aloud, think aloud, and story retelling. So reading aloud is having me up there read the story, then think, asking questions about the story, and thinking aloud would be showing students how to think through the story, think through what's happening, and then have us practice retelling the story to strengthen our fluency component of retelling. And then differentiation will be picture clues, sentence starters, and a comic strip format versus something like this where students could build it throughout the page instead of going from problem to then the solution. Students will be able to say this happened, then this happened, then this, rather than something similar to this. And then having our community come in is a big part of our classroom. So I said have a local librarian or even our school librarian come into the classroom and share various folk tales or their favorite folk tale that they have in book form, just to allow students to see other folk tales versus just this one that we're focusing on for the week. And then for writing this week, we're going to be planning a story. So we will organize the narrative with a beginning, a middle, and the end. We're going to have graphic organizers, so the story mountain would be created for their narrative. And then group planning using a shared story, so we would create one similar to this for our class. And then technology would be a Google Slides for planning versus having to keep up with the story mountain. Google automatically will save everything that the kids do, and that will help alleviate some of the meltdowns that may happen if students lose their story mountain or extra work that students will have to do if they lose it. Strategies would be whole group modeling. So whenever we're doing our shared story, we'll talk about something that happened to us as a class, and students will be able to say what happened in the beginning, the build up, the problem, the resolution, and then the ending. And then students will also be able to collaborate with their peers to talk about what happened as a class, make sure we're all understanding what happened as the class, and maybe even for some students that may not have been there, they can talk to their peers and say, this is what happened, and get the students to tell the story so we're all able to build our story mountain together. And then our differentiation, we have different template options of this where maybe it's not as small boxes or as different versions of this in Google Classroom for students or Google Slides. And then scribing, which is writing for our ELLs, and those with it as an accommodation since we have a few of those in our classroom. And especially with our ELLs and some of our students, they focus more on being able to spell things rather than just getting the ideas onto the paper. And it can take quite a long time for some of our students to get their ideas onto the paper, even though we know that they have them in their head. And then progress monitoring for this week will be a checkpoint, so story plan review of their stories, and that pulls students to small group time on an individual basis to understand and go through what their story is going to be about. And then week 4 in phonics is a review and prefix game week. So the objective is students will reinforce and apply all prefixes taught so far in the unit. So our activities for this week would be Prefix Jeopardy, Create a Word Challenge, and Literacy Centers, where students are working with each other to build their skills of creating words and practicing prefixes. And then this week, since it's a big review week, we'll focus on our technology on Kahoot, which is a live quiz review game. And then Quizzes is more of an individual classroom review game where students work individually and see the results after the whole activity is done. Some strategies that we use would be spiral review, going back, hitting all the prefixes that we've learned, and then game-based learning and repeated exposure. Since students are doing this on a weekly basis, they're seeing it over and over and over again. Some differentiation will be centers at various complexity levels. So some students that are higher or understand prefixes a little bit better would have more challenging base words to create, base words to pair with the prefixes, while some of our students that are still grasping at the idea would get some easier base words to create with the prefixes. Peer tutoring would happen between students, and then heterogeneous grouping for our Prefix Jeopardy, just to make the grouping fairer for students, to not give one team a big advantage over another. And then progress monitoring will be checklists during the game activity, so see who really understands it and who is still struggling. And then community involvement would be to invite parents for a prefix game activity. So have them join in on a Kahoot game or a Quizzes or even Prefix Jeopardy with their students, just so that they can see all the things that we're learning throughout the classroom. And then our week 4 reading would be story structure deep dive, where we're focusing on what makes the story. So the students will identify story structure, beginning, middle, and end, which is RL 2.5. And students will read A Bad Case of the Stripes by David Shannon, and they will have a cut and paste story structure sorting activity where they have to say if it happened in the beginning, if it happened in the middle, or if it happened at the end. And then students will retell the story orally using beginning, middle, and end cards. So focus on this happened in the beginning, this happened in the middle, and this happened at the end. So kind of working towards that summary ability of being able to retell the story. And then technology, we would have the digital book creation using Book Creator, which is an app in our Clever Classroom, where students are able to create books based on what we have already read. So we will focus on shared reading and visual modeling, which is a big part of our classroom, is the modeling, showing students exactly what we're expecting of them. Some differentiation will be visual cards with sentence stems, so showing what happened in the beginning with a picture, and then this happened in the beginning, and have students finish off the sentence. And then character notes that we would create as a class, where students are understanding that things about the various characters and what is happening to those characters. And then progress monitoring is students would have to be able to identify beginning, middle, and end of another text. Since we have worked so hard and deeply with A Bad Case of the Stripes, theirs would be to identify beginning, middle, and end and apply that. And then our community connection would be interview an older family member about different story versions. So just getting kids to talk to people in their lives versus just kind of being there with them. Have them talk and build that connection and that community for them. And then writing for week 4 is writing the beginning of our story. So students will write an engaging story beginning that introduces the character and the setting. So for this week, we're going to reread The Relatives Are Coming, and then we're going to focus on analyzing the hook of that story. So we're going to practice those hook techniques, so writing a question, a strong feeling, an action, or even some dialogue between some characters to hook our readers. And then we're going to take a day and write an introduction in our group story that we're sharing and creating together. And then we're going to allow students to have time to write the introduction of their narrative. And then technology would be typing practice through Typing Club, because we want to make sure that we're building this each week. So we would do a lot of this in Google Classroom and Google Docs, because it's saving it and it's always going to be there, so the students can refer back to it and make changes without having to take as much time of rewriting things and reconfiguring the story. So students will have typing practice through Typing Club, and then strategies would be mini lessons and sentence starters for each of the hooks. So a sentence starter for question, a sentence starter for strong feeling, and action and dialogue. And then cultural awareness is to let students share stories from their culture. So you want them to share what is happening in their house, in their world, not what's happening through their best friend's world. You want to see into their world, start telling part of their story. And the differentiation will be oral retelling before writing. So that would be through Flip, where students can tell the computer what happened and then play it back as they're typing it, or even text to speech, where students are able to speak it into text on their computer. And then progress monitoring will be to collect and review introductions. So pull students and say, this is what we need to beef up, this is what you did good on, and just give them suggestions on how they can start making this their best writing that they possibly can. And then week 5, phonics, is introduction to suffixes. So students will identify and the purpose of suffixes. So they'll have to be able to understand what full, less, and the suffix y means in context to the words that we're using. So students will create a word sort with their a base and a suffix. So they'll have to determine if it's a base or a suffix. And then the suffix spinner, so they'll spin the suffix, create a word, and use it in a sentence to be able to understand what that means. So our technology usage for this week is BrainPop Junior has a bunch of good suffix videos where it introduces suffixes and it talks about each suffix and how to use it in context. So we'll definitely be using some of those resources, and then also word sorts through WordWall or even Nearpod. And then strategies that we would use would be morpheme dissection, so what each part of the word, and then anchor chart building as a class, so determine what it means. And then our differentiation would be to use pictures for meaning, so show pictures of careful, show pictures of joyless, and then create sentence frames. And then for students that are grasping suffixes really well, I would have them write silly stories using three suffix words that they could come up with through the suffix spin, or even their favorite suffix of how they would describe a character. And then progress monitoring will be a suffix application sheet where they take the word and apply it into sentences that they have not seen before and use context clues to better answer those questions. Then week 5 for author's purpose and point of view for reading. Students will identify characters' point of view in a story, and then students will also compare how characters feel or react to the same event. So through this, our activities would be to read the true story of the Three Little Pigs. Then students will have a point of view sort, so would it be whose point of view is this coming from, and then read aloud with the voice changes, so focus on what a wolf may sound like or what a pig may sound like, and have different conversations about what each of our characters sound like as we're reading through our story. We will also go through Flipbook, which is where students can create their own book. It's also known as Flipgrid, but it's just where students are able to create their own story. And then a Who Was Right activity, where students voice their opinions of the story. And this is also previewing it for a later lesson of comparing two stories. So who do you think was right in this? Do you think maybe the pigs told the story right, or do you think the wolf told the story right? And then technology would be the use of Flipgrid, and then creating digital Venn diagrams to say the different characters' point of view and how you can tell it's the different characters. Strategies used would be dialogic reading, which is just having it in different voices, and then readers theater, where students are able to act out the story, and then graphic organizers of being able to compare the author's purpose and the point of view. And then differentiation would be sentence starters, visual, and emojis, so students can see how a wolf may look, if they're happy or if they're mad or if they're being lied about. And then progress monitoring would be an observation during the Flipgrid activity. And then community connection will be point of view theater, where students are able to perform short skits in different voices. So have students say, do the true story of the Three Little Pigs, which is told by a wolf. Have that, and then have the true story of the real story of the Three Little Pigs told by the pigs, and just have them compare those two in the short skits, because they are told from a different point of view, and they are also have different purpose. And then week 5 is focusing on the middle or the problem and events in our story of writing. So students will write sequential events that build the tension and story. So students will have a sequencing game, so similar to this and similar to this, where students have to put them in order of what happens first, what happens next. Then we're going to practice rewriting familiar stories with changed events. So since we just did the true story of the Three Little Pigs, I said we could write about the Three Little Pigs when none of the houses got blown down, and talk about what happened, and how that changed the story. Then we're going to write the problem or events of a shared story as our class. So what happened in the middle, what was the problem, what changed, how did we get there, and the students are going to write the problem and events of their story. So modeling what we did as a class into their own writing. And then technology integration would also include the Google Classroom document that we're creating, and Book Creator. Strategies would be story strips or timelines for students to say, well, this happened, then at this time this came, and allowing them to build it differently versus having to write it, or even use the story map. And then differentiation would be provide events list for choice for students. So when you're creating that map and you're looking through it in the introduction, you can work with students to build a choice of like what happened, like, and just be able to give them choices to lead them into that middle section of their writing. And then progress monitor will be a teacher-student writing conference to discuss the story progress, look at it, build on it, to help students have the best writing that they can have. And then we're on to week 6. So understanding full and less. So students will decode words with full and less suffixes and determine the meaning. So activities would be word family trees where students can create the suffix and then build all the different root words that can come up here to build those family trees. And then a class poster of positive and negative suffix words. So joyful and careless would be examples of positive and negative. And then students will use Google Slides to do a suffix match activity. And then strategies would be context clues and semantic mapping for word families. And then differentiation will be use of real photos or clip art with suffix meanings, so showing how somebody is joyful and how somebody would be careless. So just allowing students to see those real photos or those visuals. And then exit tickets with a define and use format where students are having to define what their prefix means or suffix means and using it in a sentence. And then cultural awareness would be to describe and discuss how feelings are described in different languages. So many of our feelings have a suffix. So joyful, somebody full of joy, but in different languages, maybe that's not how they describe it. And just showing students that just because it's our way doesn't mean it's the right way, and that there are all different kinds of ways that you can describe people through different languages. And then for week 6, we're focusing on text to self connections in reading. So students will make personal connections with characters, settings, and events in a story. And students will describe how a character's experiences relate to students' own lives. So that's RL 2.1 and 2.7. So we will read Wimberly Worried by Kevin Hinks. And then we're going to write and draw a personal experience to the character. So we'll write it out and we'll draw it. And then we're going to have those interactive read alouds. We're going to do a my story and their story. So they felt like a character activity. And then the gallery walk where all the students are able to see what each person wrote and drew and be able to share their work as students and peers. Technology for this week would be Seesaw and Padlet, which are similar platforms where students are able to create activities and create their work. And then Storyline Online, which is where students can listen to authors and famous people read their story. So Wimberly Worried is on Storyline Online and having students go into Storyline Online and have them read it. And then strategies used would be think aloud, modeling, and partner sharing, where students are able to share their ideas with their partners. And then sentence stems, visuals, and illustrated word banks would be differentiation for students that need it. And then progress monitoring would be exit tickets, review student journal, and check-ins with students to see how they're coming along with their work. And then community connection would be to invite parents to read a book that has meant something to them as a child, just allowing them to share their text to self connection with the students in the classroom. And then writing for week 6 is focusing on the ending and solution. So the objective is that students will write a satisfying ending that resolves the story problem. So students will read Click Clack Moo, Cows That Type, and then they will write 3 possible endings for their story, and then they will choose the best one. So students will use technology to animate the ending using Powtoon, which is an animation app for students where they're able to create it. And it allows students to be able to move the characters through the video. And then some strategies would be a story circle feedback where they break the story up and then into another story map similar to the mountain, where they're able to talk about what is happening in their story. And then the cultural awareness would be showcase stories with different morals and endings, and then offer conclusion sentence frames. And progress monitoring will be to meet with students to review their conclusions. So some strong conclusions would be dialogue, feelings, what lesson they learned, and to better create a wrap up of the story. All right. And then phonics for week 7 is understanding and est. So students will decode words with and est and suffixes and determine their meanings. So suffix Olympics is where students are comparing to see who is the tallest, who are taller, who is fastest or faster, and saying just comparing the two suffixes with each other. And then picture sorts, so saying what's big, what's bigger, and what's the biggest. And then technology seesaw comparison suffix activity, where they're able to create the activity where students can compare suffixes. And then the word wall suffixes is another game site where students are able to play various learning games based on the suffixes. So strategies would be explicit instruction, and then peer comparison games in the suffix Olympics, and then also the game theory, where students are able to apply their knowledge in the game form, and that builds that competitiveness through students, which in turn motivates them to do their best. So differentiation will be sentence scaffolds, real world objects for tactile comparison. So pencils, cups, phones, people, those are all tactile things that they can see, feel, touch, that can make concrete connections in their mind. And then community elements would be compare local landmarks, foods, and animals. So like just building that community, saying like, in our town we have a splash pad and we have parks. So saying which one is bigger, which one has the best activities, and just having students compare those two things. Reading for week 7 is comparing story versions. So students will compare 2 versions of a story, which is RL 2.9. So students will read Cinderella and watch the Disney version of Cinderella, and then they will complete a Venn diagram saying what is different and what is the same between the 2 versions. And then group discussion on culture and setting differences. So how did one setting compare to another setting, since there are so many versions of Cinderella that have been created. Technology usage would be Tumble Books to access the read alouds, since many of the versions have read alouds. That would be a good time to allow students to listen to the other versions. So strategies would be literature circles, where students are able to talk as a group, versus in explicit instruction where the teacher is doing a lot of the talking. And then students will have small group support. So me and my pair would push in to help students, and then sentence stems to help them create their ideas verbally. So progress monitoring will be the compare and contrast writing that we would complete. And then community connection will be have a costume day for students to come in dressed as their favorite cultural character. So some may come dressed up as Spider-Man and different versions of Spider-Man, but that's all part of our culture in our classroom. So for week 7 in writing, we're focusing on revising. So students will revise their drafts for clarity, detail, and sequence. So students will use a checklist similar to this one over here where it talks about adding details, improving verbs, and add feelings. So students will focus on arms, which is where students add words or sentences to enhance the meaning. Remove unnecessary or repetitive words or sentences. Move words or sentences so it makes more sense. And then substitute boring words or sentences for a better choice. Students will do some peer revising with their partners, teacher conferences with me and my paraprofessional to focus on the revising process with the students. Technology will be voice-to-text tools for revising, so the Google Docs dictation. And then strategies would be highlighting changes and color-coded editing. So maybe a pink marker for adding words, an orange marker for removing, a gray marker for moving words, and then a green marker for substituting boring words. And then differentiation will be to work in guided groups for revisions. So pulling groups of students to focus on find me words that can enhance the meaning, pull out some unnecessary details, and then progress monitoring will be revisions marked on a draft for students. And then week 8, we're focusing on suffix story time. So students will apply understanding of suffixes in context. So full, less, y, and s. So students will write a story using at least 5 suffix words. They will do a suffix scoop, which is a classroom movement quiz where they're able to go in and answer the questions. So like on our page, these will be cut into 4s and placed around the classroom, and students will have to go and answer the questions on their clipboard, writing A, B, or C as the correct answer, and then we'll come back together and answer each question as a class. Technology would continue using that book creator where students are able to write their story. We would use story-based reinforcement and word building and writing so that students are showing that they can use these words in context. Differentiation will be sentence frames, suffix spelling chart, support so that they're able to see how I add each of one of my suffixes to the words. And then progress monitoring will be suffix checklist in student writing, so making sure that we're following that they can use full, less, y, and s. And then for reading week 8, we're going to focus on illustrations and text meaning. So students will explain how illustrations support understanding in RL 2.7. So the activities will be a picture walk through Officer Buckle and Gloria after we have read the story. Students will then match the text that they're reading with the illustrations from the book. And then they are going to create their own illustrated short story. And so students will use the Book Creator app. They will use the visual thinking strategy, modeling, and explicit instruction from me to apply it to their own learning. And differentiation will be sentence frames, partner work for decoding text and images, especially for some of those more difficult images that they may have trouble understanding. They can work with their partner to make sure that they're decoding the text and images properly. And then progress monitoring, they would be given a picture and they would have to define the illustration, like what it's trying to portray, and then ask a local artist to discuss illustration techniques. Especially since we don't have a art class in our school, This would allow students to express their artistic abilities through using the illustrations for their own writing. And for writing, week 8 is editing and publishing. So students will edit for punctuation, spelling, and capitalization and publish their final drafts. So we would have editing stations. We would follow that. Color coding. So for capital letters would be blue. Understanding, it would be green. Punctuation would be pink, and spelling would be red. That allows students to see exactly what we're trying to get them to do following this cup. So it's C for capital letters, U for understanding, P for punctuation, and S for spelling. Students will also create the illustrations to go along with their story. And in technology, the Chromebook will be used for digital publishing using the Book Creator and their Google Classroom with their Google Docs, so they're able to easily transfer it from one to the other. Strategies will be doing peer review and using that checklist, so CUPS checklist, to make sure that we're checking off each part of our editing. And then cultural awareness would have bilingual editions and translations. Since Google Docs can do that quickly for us, it allows for students to be able to, if they understand their home language, they can use it quickly. Then differentiation is sentence by sentence editing. So focus on one sentence at a time instead of the whole writing piece. And then assistive tools that are in Google Classroom and Google Docs that kind of highlight things that need to be changed. And then progress monitoring would be they would turn in that editing checklist, and I would review and make sure that they're understanding exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And then our final week is phonics. Week 9 is assessment and showcase. So we would have all our sharing and showcases done on one day in that last week, since it is where families are invited to celebrate the learning that the students have done. So our objective is students will demonstrate mastery of prefixes and suffixes through multiple formats. So activities would be a prefix and suffix quiz, creating an illustrated word dictionary, and word builder showcase for families. So showing our families how we are building these words. And then technology uses would be a Google Forms quiz and a Seesaw digital portfolio that they would turn in. And then strategies would be a cumulative review, student-led goal setting, so that they're understanding what their goal is, what they're trying to get to, and working towards that throughout the whole unit. And then differentiation will be oral assessments for students that need it, and then sentence frames and stems to help those that still struggle getting their own ideas onto the paper. And then progress monitoring, we would have a rubric for their writing for the sentence frames and stems. And then community connection will be families would be invited to celebrate the learning. So they'd be invited to come in and see how we build the words, how we have done, and showcase our illustrated word dictionary to our families. Then week 9 will be our literacy showcase. So students will demonstrate comprehension final projects. So this is focusing on RL 2.1 to 2.9, so all of our standards. Students will present their favorite book and story that they wrote. So throughout our whole unit, we've read many different stories, and students will be able to present their favorite one as well as their narrative story that they've written. So the class book fair and reading gallery walk, where students and families will be able to walk through and see all of our learning that we have done. Technology would be Flipgrid. Strategies would be student-led conferences and modeling. Differentiation would be multiple project formats and buddy reading. And then progress monitoring will be the final project covering story writing, presentation, and comparison. And then family literacy celebration, where we will invite parents and local leaders to showcase our whole 9-week unit that we have done. And then writing, week 9 is sharing and reflection. So our students will share their published narrative and reflect on their writing growth. So our activities would include the author's chair, where students are able to read their story aloud to the class in our favorite chair. And then our gallery walk of stories is where students can showcase their story to their families and classmates. And then reflection sheet would be just talking about how much they have grown from one to the next, from the beginning of our unit to the end of our unit, and how much they have grown and learned. Some technology would be to record readings for a video sharing students writing with their parents, especially if their parents can't come in on the day that they're chosen to share their writing. This allows you to build that home connection with the parents, as well as building that relationship of showing how much their student can do based on what they've learned. So showcasing their learning to their parents. And then strategies would have our celebration and our student praise notes, so talking about what they did excellent with in their story. Maybe it's their storytelling, maybe it's their drawings, maybe it's their writing, just giving them that praise. And then cultural awareness would be the sharing the videos home with parents of their student, just so that they can see how much their student has grown. And then differentiation would be to allow for students to tell the story instead of reading the story. So students are able to tell what they wrote about rather than having to read it word for word. And then allowing for a microphone to be used for some of those students that have a harder time reading aloud loudly. And then progress monitoring would be the final rubric and the reflection sheet, just to see how much students have grown. And then our conclusion for this unit is, so this is a second grade literacy curriculum for the third 9 weeks, fosters a balanced and supportive learning environment where students develop foundational reading, phonics, and writing skills. By focusing on a narrative writing, understanding prefixes and suffixes, and identifying key ideas and details in text, students are better equipped with tools they need to become confident, capable readers and expressive writers. Through intentional and explicit instruction, continuous assessment, and engaging learning experiences, this curriculum supports academic growth and a lifetime love of literacy. So I hope you enjoyed my second grade curriculum.